I'm trying to make this video a bit faster paced than the earlier ones in the series, so if it's too fast for you, hit pause, watch it twice, look at the subtitles, read the transcript, or do whatever you feel is necessary. The three characters you see at the top of the screen look like they follow exactly the same pattern. They don't. Your textbooks may have taught you that the symbol they have in common, shown in the lower half of the screen, is a picture of an intersection or a crossroads. For the moment, I would file that advice under kind of, sort of, maybe, sometimes. Looking at our three examples on the top, we can see that all three of them split this symbol into two halves to add a new glyph in the middle. It looks like we've got a clear pattern here, with the glyph added in the middle providing the sound for the modern character, and the image of the intersecting roads providing a hint as to the meaning. If you've heard the sound of this combined character, tong, it will always have been in the two-syllable word hutong, meaning a small street, lane, or alley. So, in this case, we've got the appealing illusion that the Chinese language makes a lot of sense. The second example doesn't have the same phonetic pattern, but still, on the whole, we can believe that we're looking at the same rule, if there is a rule, and again, the meaning has to do with streets, roads, and so on. Given the pattern of the first two characters, you may be inclined to convince yourself that the third example conforms to the same standard, especially if you're learning Chinese in a classroom setting, memorizing as many words as possible for the next exam. Just like the first example, we've got the appealing symmetry of the glyph in the center providing the phonetic value for the combined character as a whole. Although the two characters look and even sound as if they're examples of the same rule, they actually demonstrate two fundamentally different patterns in how the language works and how we have to think about the Chinese system of radicals. With the example at the top, we'd be entirely correct to break the word down into its smallest units. But the etymology for the example at the bottom only makes sense in its combined form, and, in fact, breaking it down into smaller pieces makes less sense. The radical in the middle of the word wei is the soft leather radical, and the meaning of the word has nothing to do with soft leather. Many people would just stop you from thinking any further about why the word is written this way, telling you it's just phonetic, don't worry about it. Believe it or not, the so-called soft leather radical is actually a picture of 2 feet, pacing in opposite directions on either side of a box. In the combined character, wei, there are 2 more feet added to the picture, for a total of 4. In this case, very clearly, the radical xing does not represent an intersection of roads, but really does depict 2 human feet. Don't believe me? Well, now you can see the ancient pictographs on the left side of the screen, and the etymology leaps out at you right away. In this case, it's the combined character as a whole that makes sense, not the individual parts. If we think of the radicals as the atoms composing the language, then the lesson to be learned here is that some words can only be understood as a molecule, gathering a few of those atoms together at once. And, in fact, they stop making sense when we break them down into smaller pieces. The 4 feet walking around the box are, apparently, on patrol. So this pictograph as a whole suggests the meaning protection, defense, and so on. In this case, it's actually the smaller part at the top that has its meaning only through a phonetic coincidence. The glyph itself has nothing to do with leather, whereas in fact Chinese does have several other pictographs that are directly related to leather and animal hides. I think it's fair to say that nobody could have guessed this from the modern characters, especially not in the comparative context of so many glyphs that are assembled the other way around, and that do need to be understood as atoms rather than as molecules. However, we do get some corroboration from a third character that sounds like wei. As is often the case with really ancient pictographs in the language, a different version was preserved as another word. So we can see here at the bottom of the screen another meaning related to the original image, this time with a wall added around the outside. You can imagine that it would be misleading to explain this third character as just being a square around the leather radical, and it would be even worse to dismiss questions about why it's written this way by telling people, don't worry about it, it's just phonetic. However, that is exactly what we end up doing so often when we're rushing through Chinese in the classroom context. So what seemed like such an obvious pattern wasn't a pattern at all when we were looking at how these characters were formed by combining two parts into one. However, we have similar puzzles even when we're looking at simple glyphs consisting of just one symbol. If your teacher has told you anything about the character Dan, it was probably something like, "It's just phonetic, don't worry about it." However, we can see right away that it is an ancient pictograph that is trying to depict something, even if we don't know what it might be. And we can see from the more ancient form, shown on the left here, that the two smaller boxes at the top can't be separated from the picture as a whole, even if we have no idea what the symbol is supposed to resemble. If you try to break it down into smaller atoms, you'll get pieces that don't relate to the meaning of the image at all. Richard Sears came up with a clever explanation for this one. Sears is the guy who scanned the images of ancient characters and put them on the internet, and it seems that this explanation is one that he invented himself. In the same way that we noticed before that the soft leather radical made more sense in the context of a larger character, Sears looked through the combinations of Dan to try to find a context that explained what the pictograph originally was. His conclusion was that it depicts a cicada. If he's correct, that doesn't mean that we would be wrong to say the symbol is just phonetic when it appears in other contexts, but it lets us see what the context was that the symbol was borrowed from. Overall, I think that this explanation is a lot more plausible than any of the others available, but if you wanted to challenge it, you could basically go through the same sort of experiment that led Richard Sears to his conclusion. You can find the same symbol in other contexts, you can contrast their meanings, and try to sort out which one might give a hint as to the first purpose the pictograph was put to. However, the most fundamental lesson here is just that we can't always understand the character better by breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces. Sometimes, instead, we have to put the atoms together into molecules and try to figure out what relationships between them might be. The Chinese language is ancient enough that some false etymologies following this same pattern have been written into the language and start to appear as facts. The symbol you see here is written as two moons, side by side, and is part of the most common word for friendship. Although it might be romantic to explain friendship as two moons side by side, the ancient Chinese were interested in finding another, better explanation for why the word is written this way. So, at some stage, way back in antiquity, they tried the same trick we just used in suggesting that Dan was originally a picture of a cicada. In this case, instead, the idea was that the two moons were originally two wings, in a combined form with one of the symbols for bird that you can see here on the right. This idea is still listed as valid in many dictionaries, and some computer fonts try to make both of these characters resemble wings, in imitation of the seal script characters that were influenced by the two wings theory. Unfortunately, as you can see here, the evidence indicates that this just isn't true. The glyph didn't originally depict two moons, but it certainly wasn't a pair of wings either. If you're familiar with Chinese animal characters, there was actually a hint that the two wings theory must be wrong in just looking at the combined bird character. The bird faces towards the left, so it wouldn't make much sense for the wings to be positioned in front of its face. In this case, we can't guess the original meaning of the character by looking at it in combination, and we also can't figure it out by breaking the modern symbol into smaller parts. Neither moons nor wings, the most ancient form of the symbol is depicting something that we still can't guess at. So, our practical conclusions here run contrary to the logic presumed by the system of radicals. Sometimes the basic unit of meaning is not the atom, but the molecule. Larger groups of symbols are sometimes the only way to know what a single symbol means in isolation. However, there is absolutely no pattern, rule, or system involved. We just have observations to compare to other observations. Sometimes the names and meanings of the radicals are misleading because the system of radicals is much less ancient than the pictographs they're used to define. Sometimes what seems to be a phonetic pattern is not phonetic at all. Conversely, what sometimes looks like a symbolic pattern linking two characters visually may be arbitrary and misleading. When your teachers tell you, "Don't worry about it, it's just phonetic," you might find it really rewarding to ignore their advice and take some time to look into the real etymologies of the characters to discover there's a lot more to know than just that.